first, we're very excited to be here today, but before we get started, we would like to acknowledge, I think on the next slide, that the land the University of California, Irvine is on is the traditional territory of the Ashimen and Tongva peoples who, in the face of ongoing settler colonialism, continue to act as stewards of their ancestral lands. Both Ashimen and Tongva nations continue to claim their place in their traditional territory. We would like to honor and respect the diverse Native and Indigenous peoples connected to this territory on which we virtually gather today. So, as I said, we're very glad to be here today, and I would like to just start by giving you a quick preview of where we're headed in this presentation time, and introduce myself. I'm Keramet Reiter, a professor in criminology and law at UC Irvine. I study prison conditions and policy, and I have worked as a prison educator for more than 20 years. I'm first going to provide an introduction to the project and our origin story in the first few slides, and then my colleague Joanne is going to talk about the current status of the project, our team, our collection, our website. And then my colleague Gabe will next go into a bit more detail about our story collection process and the ways we have engaged and addressed ethical concerns throughout the project. And then Elvia will provide an overview of our long-term preservation and access plans in close collaboration with the UC libraries. Before we move into the Q&A with you all, we'll reflect together on lessons we've learned through the project as we've worked together. As you'll gather throughout our presentation, our project is at a pivotal midpoint. We have collected thousands of stories and plan to continue doing so at least through the end of this 2021 year. We're processing these stories and working to develop a longer-term plan for preservation and access. So we're excited towards the end to talk with you all more about that and get your feedback also. So, PrisonPandemic started as a reactive response to COVID-19 in prisons, especially in California. I, along with two other professors and two doctoral students, all of whom study the lived experiences and consequences of incarceration, watched anxiously as COVID-19 ravaged California prisons in the spring and summer of 2020. California's San Quentin State Prison took on the dubious distinction of having one of the largest COVID-19 clusters in the United States in the summer of 2020. More than 2/3 of incarcerated people at San Quentin were infected and 25 died. In the years since, nearly everyone at the prison has tested positive for COVID at some point, and 3 more people have died. So you can see in this slide a graph from our website reflecting these numbers and those intense spikes at San Quentin in the summer of 2020. As I mentioned, I've worked as an educator in prison, legal advocate for improvement of prison conditions, and scholar of the history of extreme punishments. Given this work, I wasn't surprised by the intensity of the COVID-19 outbreak at San Quentin in the summer of 2020, but the predictability of the outbreak was all the more infuriating to me, and I was desperate to find some way to communicate with and support the people locked inside our prisons. I was talking to colleagues and doctoral students over Zoom, of course, and we started brainstorming about what we could do. Being academics, our first response to the outbreak at San Quentin was to write a few op-eds about the importance of protecting incarcerated people and staff, arguing that they are not as removed or separated from our communities as people would like to think. But infections and deaths kept rising. So we started a campaign to raise money to make donations of protective equipment to state prisons in our vicinity, responding to incarcerated people telling stories about how they had no access to masks or soap inside. So we produced a short video pictured here with current and formerly incarcerated students about people's experiences of the pandemic in prison. And we'll play just a brief excerpt of it to give you a sense of what we were hearing at the very beginning of the pandemic.
The COVID infection rate in California's prisons is 600% higher than in California overall.
This is a public health crisis.
This is a community crisis.
This is a racial justice crisis. People who are getting sick and dying of COVID are people of color.
Prisons are not a closed system. Officers go home, they go live their lives, they come back, they get sick. They're the ones that are going to get the inmates sick.
So this gives you a small sense of who we were talking to, what we were hearing. And as we were seeking to make the connection between our work as educators and our obligations to support and protect our students. So Gabe will talk more about the process of collecting these first stories and initially getting the word out about the project. But as you can tell just from listening to this video, people talked about lack of access to protective equipment, being locked down in their cells with no access to activities, exercise, education, or even phones. They talked about missing their families who were prohibited from visiting for months and ultimately more than a year. In the process of producing this video, we learned that people inside were not only scared and isolated, but also desperate to tell their stories and to know that someone outside of prison was listening. Although a number of organizations like UCLA's COVID-19 Behind Bars had started to gather data about infection rates and prison policies during the pandemic, none were actually talking directly with the incarcerated, listening or sharing their stories. So we scrambled to set up a hotline that could collect calls from prison. That's the only way incarcerated people can dial out, is to have someone who's willing to accept a collect call. And we staffed the hotline with graduate students and later undergraduate students from 5 to 9 p.m. on weekdays. We started spreading the word on social media and through community organizations, and we set up a PO box too, in case people had trouble getting access to phones or did not want to use their limited time, usually only 15 minutes a day, to call us. And we started to build a website where these stories could be shared so that people who had felt silenced could know their voices were being heard, becoming more widely accessible. From the beginning, we were centrally concerned with ethics and with protecting vulnerable populations. We wanted to, one, be a repository for as many stories as people wanted to share. Two, make these stories available to a wider public to increase awareness of the crisis in our prisons and bring voices to the numbers of infections and deaths as quickly as possible. All while, three, protecting our contributors from any breaches of confidentiality or retaliation. My colleague Gabe will talk more about how we process all of these ethical challenges later in the conversation. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to Joanne, who will speak next.
Hi, I'm Joanne DeCaro. I'm a graduate student in Criminology, Law, and Society, and I research trauma and long-term incarceration. I also help run a legal clinic for paroled lifers. I spend a lot of time with men who have been recently released from prison. And when the pandemic hit, everything I knew from these men about the lack of basic medical care they received had me flat out terrified for what was coming. I work with an older population that typically has a high degree of underlying conditions. I knew that many of the men still inside would be at an elevated risk of succumbing to this deadly disease. I wanted to help people understand their fears, concerns, and the amazing courage and support so many of the men and women inside have shown. I would like to now tell you a bit about the project. First, I would like to introduce you to our core team. You have already heard from Keramet, who researches prisons, prisoners' rights, and extreme punishment. Naomi is also a professor in the Department of Criminology, Law, and Society. She researches employment and reentry and social inequality. Kristen is a professor in the Sociology Department. She researches the impact of criminal justice, contact on the family. Finally, Gabe is a graduate student in the Department of Criminology, Law, and Society. He researches programming for incarcerated individuals. Our project initially focused on collecting calls and letters from the 35 state prisons in California. People go to state prisons after they have been convicted of and sentenced for their crimes. Sentences are at least 1 year and typically longer than 2 years. At the beginning of the pandemic, the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation housed roughly 100,000 prisoners. More than 1 year into our project, we have successfully outreached to all 35 state prison facilities. We have received over 340 calls from incarcerated individuals telling us their stories. We have also received over 2,300 letters from incarcerated individuals writing to us about their experiences. We have been able to put up 826 stories onto our website and are adding new stories to the site regularly. Our site itself has received over 3,400 unique views. To manage a project of this nature, we have had 175 undergraduate student volunteers and field study students over the course of 6 quarters. We have also had the support of numerous graduate students. Over the past summer, the project has made a concerted effort to expand our outreach to all forms of adult detention facilities in California, which includes county jails, ICE detention facilities, and federal prison facilities. This includes populations who are in pretrial detention, serving short sentences, are involved in immigration proceedings, and serving sentences on federal convictions. We have so far outreached to 17 counties and their jail populations, 9 federal facilities, and 2 ICE detention facilities. We have sent out a total of 14,200 outreach letters to these new facilities just this summer alone. We are in the process of redesigning our project site to encompass this broader range of stories and make the site more story-centric. The main modification we are adding to accomplish this is an advanced search feature to filter by date, facility type, individual facilities, topics, and contributor type. We're also adding a collections feature to the site to allow curated collections of stories that can pull up stories from across the entire corpus. Currently, our site as it is now presents stories in a manner that focuses more on specific facilities and the stories within them. Finally, as Elvia will discuss later, we are in the process of transitioning to archiving our corpus. In particular, we have been negotiating the best manner to preserve stories while upholding the ethics and anonymity of the data collection and website display process. Gabe will next discuss some of the ethical considerations on the project.
Hello, everyone. My name is Gabe Rosales, and I'm a graduate student in the Criminology, Law, and Society Department of UC Irvine. I've also been a rehabilitative program provider in state prison for years. On the left, you see a picture taken during one of my classes. When the pandemic began, my class was on the verge of completing the last week of our program. We were unfortunately unable to graduate our cohort. As we began hearing about rising infection rates and the lack of personal protective equipment inside, it was clear that all of us, academics and advocates, had to do something. On the right, you see an image of a front page headline describing the lockdown in an Orange County jail after gang riots when I was serving time. The plight of those incarcerated is not only a close concern of mine because of my classes inside and the relationships I've developed, I'm also formerly incarcerated. My incarceration experience at such a tumultuous time is what began my trajectory towards rehabilitation and criminal justice. I participated in the creation of the video mentioned by Keramet, also detailing my experiences of the county jail healthcare system and the negligence I witnessed. Additionally, some of the testimonies featured in the video were from old students of mine who had been released, as well as a few students that were still inside. As Keramet mentioned, the core team members of PrisonPandemic are educators who have worked with the incarcerated population for decades, a systems impacted person, and myself, a formerly incarcerated person. With the creation of this video and ultimately with the inception of PrisonPandemic, elevating the voices of those incarcerated people, explaining their experiences inside prison during a global pandemic has been the focal point of the entire project. Every voice we captured in that video, whether explaining experiences or narrating, was a formerly incarcerated or incarcerated voice. We had full support from this demographic to enlighten the public on these issues inside from the very beginning. As this project encompasses both social science and humanities elements, we've been faced with unique concerns regarding personal protection, legal repercussions, and the intellectual property rights. Due to the volatile nature of the carceral setting, there was a trade-off between protecting the anonymity of the participants against institutional and peer retaliation and personal ownership of testimonies. If a person can be personally identified by their story, we would have no way to help or protect them against blowback. If someone is identified by prison administration as a problem, this can also translate to attacks from other incarcerated people. You see, access to prison classes, yard or outdoor time, and day room out of cell time are also at stake for incarcerated people sharing their stories. Though many incarcerated people personally wanted to be named, we decided complete anonymity was ultimately the best plan of action to protect everyone. We worked with the University Council to draft consent language that allowed us to collect stories and letters and phone recordings where the incarcerated participant would release the testimony to the project to be anonymized. This would ensure that the university could not be subpoenaed by a carceral institution for a specific testimony, because we would have no way of linking any story to any one person. The consent also included permission to publish the story on the PrisonPandemic website archive repository. We asked respondents to explain to the public what their experience was being incarcerated during COVID. We intentionally kept the questions simple and open-ended because these were not formal interviews. Rather, we were providing a venue for incarcerated people to make their voices heard. Formal interview questions would classify this project as research, which would have required institutional review board oversight in social science, as well as research permission from the prison system. The process to collect these stories was meticulously calculated at every step, so I'm going to briefly break down each link in the chain. In the fall of 2020, we reached out to grassroots organizations composed of formerly incarcerated people that work with the prison population to send in flyers to encourage correspondence. The presentation of our flyers evolved over time, as you see on the left, our first flyer in the fall of 2020, in comparison to our social media team's updated flyer created in the spring of 2021. We then created an experiential and virtual field study class for the university undergraduates. The students were split into multiple teams focused on different aspects of story collection and processing. All students involved in the project signed a waiver forbidding them to share any identifiable story details and requiring them to erase all identifiable testimonies after assignments were completed. The first teams of students would write letters to specific incarcerated people at specific prisons whom they identified from a roster of most common names taken from a California census. The letters sent out were personalized, and every response we received from the incarcerated population were responded to with thank you letters. The letter testimonials we received were sent to a redaction and transcription team who diligently combed the letters for any identifying information, including any names, specific programs, specific housing units, etc. Every piece of information that could reasonably be identifiable to a specific person was removed. The final redacted testimony was typed into an edited transcription. This new transcript was put in a text format that was readable by the website. These redacted transcribed letters were sent to a voiceover team who would record themselves reading the redacted testimonies, which would then be sent to an audio editing team that would fix any audio issues. Final files were then sent to a core team member who uploaded them to a secured folder. All testimonies are backed up to a hard drive that is in the core member's possession. These outgoing letters to incarcerated people also provided a phone number to call so that people could also tell their testimonies in real time. We have a hotline team on call from 5 p.m. to 9 p.m. Monday through Friday to record live testimonies. When students receive calls, the consent form developed with the campus council was promptly read, and then the incarcerated person could decide whether they wanted to participate or not. Once these calls were complete, the students would fill out a call log detailing time, facility, and other relevant notes, such as timestamps, if some identifiable information was given. These audio files and logs were distributed to the redaction and transcription team. Once redacted and transcribed, the files were sent to the audio editing team, who would edit the redactions out of the audio. As we collected the stories and a core team member began populating the Prison Pandemic website, we had a threshold of stories to meet before publication to avoid any single person being identified from a single facility. As we developed more streamlined project protocols and increasing access to physical space on campus, we moved towards conducting letter redactions on the original letters in a physical space, rather than through secure online shared folders, as a further step towards protecting and permanently removing any identifiable participant information. Additionally, an ethics board was assembled of consultants and people who had been working with us throughout Prison Pandemic's existence to further survey our process. The 7-person board is composed of a majority of formerly incarcerated people, an in-prison program provider, 1 Prison Pandemic alumna whose family member is incarcerated, and another advocate and nonprofit founder whose partner is incarcerated. Our entire process has been scrutinized and deliberated during our meetings to ensure the safety of this vulnerable population. Now, I will play a brief clip of one of the testimonies featured on the Prison Pandemic website.
To begin, I think it's important for a lot of people out there to understand that a lot of times when you see public policy being announced by the California Department of Corrections, that policy is something that the higher ups have put in effect, but by the time it makes it to the local levels within the institutions, it's left at the discretion of the local bodies as to how it's being implemented, if it gets implemented at all.
Thank you very much. I'm going to pass it off to Elvia.
Thanks, Gabe. Hello, everyone. My name is Elvia Arroyo-Ramirez, and I am the Assistant University Archivist at UCI Libraries. Before I dive into my section, I wanted to share this photograph with you. This photograph was taken in 2015 and is the most up-to-date photograph I have with all of my family members present. My involvement in this project is inextricably personal due to the fact that my brother, Rafael, pictured here in yellow, has been in prison since 2010. To be touched by the prison industrial complex in this way means to learn to live with deep injustices precipitated by perverse capitalism and the racialized carceral state. When the opportunity to collaborate with this project team arose, I was once reminded that information work does not need to be neutral and that we mustn't extract our personal experiences from the projects we lend our labor to. Prison abolition and liberation are part of my personal politics, and I am grateful for the opportunity to work on an archival project that centers the voices of those impacted by the carceral system. Since August of 2020, I've provided consultation to the project team and advised on archival preservation and best practices for access. The nuances of the work, working to ensure the privacy of individuals, and working to feature these stories without misrepresenting the perspectives or portraying them in an extractive way are tenets that are central to me and this project team. To consult on this type of work requires a mutual understanding of the implications involved, and the work thus far has involved having many conversations about data privacy, security, language, and rights. Though collecting was spurred by the rapid response to the health crisis, the work of redaction and archiving has been necessarily slow. This work has also needed to be informed by communal recommendations and practices. There have been many times when we've needed to pause and search for guidance through our community networks and in adjacent literature, both of which have informed our work. The work of Sarah Benini, Ricardo Gomez, and Bryce Clayton Newell on information practices for migrant aid work in the US-Mexico borderlands has been influential to our thinking and approaches. Their Mind the Five guidelines seen here align with our intention to mitigate risk inherent in using information and communication technologies to document the experiences of vulnerable populations. For redaction, we come up with a list of variables to physically excise from the physical letters before we digitize to limit the possibility of misuse or a data breach. Anything that can be redacted digitally can be recovered, and thus the low-tech solution of excision made the most sense for us. As Gabe shared earlier, this decision was difficult. On the one hand, it felt like we were policing the identities of those individuals and taking their agency. On the other hand, we agreed with Benini, Gomez, and Newell when they write that when working with vulnerable populations, privacy self-management is not enough, since it is very difficult to obtain genuinely informed consent from someone who is incarcerated. Another area for pause was the extent of consent. Just because these folks agreed to participate on the Prison Pandemic project, does that consent extend to the permanent preservation of the recordings and letters in the UCI libraries? I began consulting with the project after the consent language had been drafted, and the project had a good portion of its stories already submitted. So I was worried about the lack of defined language that may make the intention to indefinitely preserve these materials clear. However, upon consultation with campus council, my supervisor, and the project team, the broadly defined terminology used in the flyers, such as stating that the project is for historical preservation, and the consent script that mentions the publication of the stories on a website repository, was deemed sufficient enough wording to enable UCI Library Special Collections to permanently preserve and provide access to these materials once the project is completed. Currently, I'm working with Joanne to advise on the project metadata codebook, which has been collectively informed through our various networks, We're also interested in reaching out to abolitionist or prison library networks like the Abolition and Special Collections Group and the Prison Solidarity Library Network to gather input for our community-informed redaction and metadata practices. We plan to meet with one of these groups very soon, so I'm looking forward to that. And future work involves training the team to ingest born digital audio files and digitize text files directly into our DAM system, which is called Nexio, as well as contribute original metadata. After this part of the project is over, special collections staff will then publish these materials on CLIR, our online digital collections portal, and the project website will then cross-reference those assets on their site. And so we hope to provide updates and subsequent documentation about this work at a future meeting.
Thank you, Elvia. So for the last few minutes of our presentation, we'd like to discuss together some of the lessons we've learned so far in this work. The project is very much still active, and we're constantly seeking new resources to help inform how we do everything. For anyone in the audience who may be familiar with similar archival projects like this one, projects working with incarcerated or other vulnerable populations, please feel free to share information or drop links in the chat. We would love to connect. And we also, of course, invite you all to speak with us during the Q&A. But first, we'll spend just a few moments talking about some of our lessons learned. I think Gabe is going to give us the first one.
Yes, it's been a huge learning curve on multiple fronts. One of the first big challenges of this project was how to outreach to this population. During pre-COVID times, we could have better used our networks of people who go into prison regularly as programming providers and legal professionals to help spread the word. Also, word of mouth would have had more impact when people inside were allowed to go to programming and other group spaces and activities. So instead, we had to get creative and switch gears to direct mailing. We never anticipated when we started this project that we would need a stamp budget in the tens of thousands of dollars. We are always looking for stamp money. With direct outreach, we've tried to be concise and informative, but also authentic in our care and concern for the population. In the same vein, running a hotline has been a new experience for all of us. There has been an endless technological and logistical challenges. Just keeping a hotline staffed 5 days a week for 4 hours a day is a huge ongoing task. And then there has been the emotional support we have needed to provide to our hotline staff to try to help them prepare for and then debrief after emotionally challenging calls. Our amazing students are hearing very raw and real stories about what incarceration is like.
Thanks, Gabe. Another challenge we are currently facing is how to transition this project from the frantic nature of collecting in the middle of a crisis to long-term preservation. There are so many aspects of this that we are now attempting to work through. Firstly, we've had to deal with the organization of all the project materials, both the materials that make up the collection and corpus that we're dealing with, but also just as importantly, all the supporting materials we have created for the project. This has included redesigning how new stories get named, inputted now through a Google form, tracked and processed. We are reimagining how this happens for use on the website and also for how this works for long-term preservation, both the preservation of the physical collection and the digital collection in CLIR. All this has been complicated by the need for anonymity for our subjects. We need to make sure that their safety remains our #1 priority during the preservation process. A small example of this is that up until recently, we have been internally saving the hotline calls with the naming convention of the prison name, the call date, and the call time. Now that we are preparing full stories to be uploaded to CLIR, we need to come up with a public naming convention for them that would still produce unique file names. On our project site, we only currently name small segments of larger stories, and those titles do not have a consistent naming convention. The full story file names never appear on our site. After consulting with our community advisory board, we decided that the call time would be too identifying to be included in a public file name. Instead, we are now generating a 5-digit sequence to be used after the prison name and the date for all the calls. On the surface, this might not seem too significant, but it is an important step we have taken to protect the anonymity of our callers in case prison officials were to track outgoing calls based on the call times. And I'll now turn it over to Keramet.
Yeah, and largely just echoing what Joanne is saying, I think big picture, one of the clearest takeaways for us thus far has been the challenge of shifting from a place of immediacy, from rapid response to thinking, to a place of permanence and how to preserve what we've collected. And likewise, as we've received more and more stories, more than I think we ever imagined, we've been relieved on the one hand to think that the more stories we have, the harder any single one is to identify. But on the other hand, I think it's forced us to create more careful and consistent processes to deal with redaction and labeling, to manage a growing collection, to make it searchable, and to kind of identify all the pieces that we do have.
Another challenge we've had is designing the project's metadata guidelines for the library archive. We've needed to work within the limits of known fields and terminology while trying to keep anonymity and respect for our population at the forefront of the planning process. One example of this is that we debated the use of the Library of Congress subject headings. How language is used to label and discuss incarcerated people can be a very sensitive topic. Members of the community strongly fight against the use of words such as inmate and convict in articles and other forms of public labeling. We want our stories to come up when searched with common terms, but we also do not want to use the language that is highly offensive to our population. Another area we're still working on is how to treat the copyright of the materials when they are anonymous and therefore not possible to be removed from the website. We go over in our consent process that since the material is anonymous, it cannot be ever removed from the website. So we feel we've done a good job explaining this to our participants, but it makes trying to figure out how to do copyright a little bit more difficult than it would be if there was clear ownership of the material with the original owner and creator of it.
So I wanted to add to the point about the challenges of shifting from immediacy to permanence. I wanted to commend this project team for their intentionality. While it was nearly impossible to involve all the necessary stakeholders from the very beginning, they had the foresight to recognize that they needed to consult with librarians and archivists in the early stages of the project to help them think through some of these difficult issues. This is not always the case, as this audience is most certainly aware. Librarians and archivists, if consulted at all in faculty or academic-driven projects, are consulted at the very end of the project's life cycle, after many decisions about ethics and privacy and data retention have already been made. So often in these projects, sustainability is not thought of as central to the project scope. But because UCI Libraries has been thought of as an active partner rather than an afterthought, we've been able to provide early consultation and ensure sustainability of the materials after the project is finished.
Yeah, thank you, Elvia. And I'll just add from the other side, I think we as the faculty have learned so much from our collaboration with the librarians. I mean, first of all, I've learned so much about the work that the librarians do to support the university, and I think I will be involving them in future projects more often. But secondly, I think the conversations we've been able to have about the ethical considerations that vary across our different professions, the problems that have arisen in archiving that I would have never known about versus the problems that arise in research, or in other policy contexts, I think have made the project much richer and allowed us to develop a much more robust protocol for thinking through how to do this ethically, and I hope be a model for others, or at least part of an ongoing conversation about this. So just as a final note, we have a slide here with the ways you can contact us. We would welcome you to reach out. And then we have links, and we'll also post them in the chat, but we have links to two documents that we would love your feedback on. One is our draft metadata codebook, and the other is our redaction guidelines. So if you have a chance to look at those, that's one thing we would love to discuss in the Q&A, but we're open to any of your questions, and we look forward to the conversation, and we really thank you for your time and for being here today.